Venezuela and Guyana might possibly go to war. Hello, my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And on today's episode, what we're going to be talking about is the potential new conflict that could be appearing here in the 21st century. Like, this is something that genuinely could break out at any given day. We don't really know what is going to happen, as Venezuela genuinely seems to be seriously thinking about invading its neighbor Guyana. As for how and why this potential conflict has come to be, well, the answer is a little bit of a long one, as much like anything to do with geopolitics, the answer typically lies with something in history. And so you all know exactly what it is that we have to do. We're going to have to jump back in time and talk about our favorite international export here, context. Now, the history of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, as they are officially known, starts in somewhat similar places: European colonialism. In 1522, Spain had first colonized what would later become Venezuela, and it would be in 1811, several hundred years later, that Venezuela would ultimately declare independence from Spain and would then join up as part of the country of Gran Colombia in 1819. Now, I know that I talked a little bit about Gran Colombia before, especially in that previous video that I did on why Venezuela seems to be collapsing. It was a very short-lived state, existing for only around a decade, but composed of what is today Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. At one point in time, many people thought that this was going to be the next superpower of South America. The United States of South America, if you will. That was one of the genuine ideas behind it. And also from that is one of those things that people love to talk about nowadays when they consider alternate history, as what if Gran Colombia had actually survived? Well, the point of it is that it did not in the first place. Only around a decade later, in 1831, Gran Colombia would ultimately dissolve, and Venezuela would go on to form a new country, that being the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And it's at this moment, when they would take to the world stage as a new country, that it would be the start of a dispute that now threatens to boil over even to this day. But we are going to get back to that in just a minute. And speaking of accidents, my life. Okay, no, but in all seriousness, I actually have been in a couple accidents here before. I even got ran over by a car while riding my bike in Japan. True story, that did actually happen. And did you know that in 2020 alone, there were over 5 million car crashes, which is more than 15,000 a day and 600 an hour? That's a lot of potential injuries. And if you're injured and you don't know where to start, then with Morgan & Morgan, it is just that easy. Because yeah, if you're lying there prone on the couch, unable to do anything, you can submit a claim and have a lawyer review your case with only 8 clicks on your phone. So remember, everyone, if you're ever injured in an accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. You can submit a claim in 8 clicks or less without ever having to leave your couch. And for more information, go to forthepeople.com or dial pound law. That's pound 529 from your cell phone, pound law. Because the next thing that we actually have to do is talk about Venezuela itself and what is currently going on in this country that, again, seems to almost be falling apart. Venezuela is today a country of nearly 29 million people. Roughly 25% of the population are white, including Hispanic, and another quarter are mestizo, meaning they are mixed white and indigenous. 40% are what are referred to as pardo, which is tri-racial mix of South European, mostly Spanish and Portuguese, West African, and indigenous South American peoples. The official language of Venezuela is Spanish. Around 88% of the population identifies as Christian, with 71% of those being Catholic, and the other 17% being Protestant, primarily evangelical. 8% are atheist or agnostic, and 3% follow other religions, including 1% of the population practicing Santeria. Now, a number of you are probably going to be confused by that last part, so I'm going to throw in this little tidbit here, but Santeria, for those who are not aware, is something that came out of a mix of Christianity and West African religions from the African diaspora through the slave trade. Anyway, Guyana is a country that is located just to the east of Venezuela. This was something that was first sighted by Columbus back in 1498, but it wasn't ultimately settled by European powers until 1581, and that being by the Dutch. In 1814, the Dutch and the British would go on to sign the London Convention, which would cede the territory to Britain officially. In 1831, this became then known as British Guyana, and this would maintain a mostly plantation-style economy up until the 1950s. Then, considering everything that was going on after World War II and British decolonization, ultimately British Guyana would achieve its independence in 1966, then going on to join the Commonwealth of Nations in 1970. Now, the name Guyana derives from Guyana, which is an earlier name for a larger region that now includes the areas called Guyana, which is the British Guyana, Suriname, which is the Dutch Guyana, French Guyana, the Guyana region in Venezuela, and also Amapá in Brazil, which is Portuguese Guyana. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the name Guyana comes from an indigenous Amerindian language that means land of many waters. And the word cooperative, which is what the nation would ultimately be after getting its independence when it became a cooperative republic, is the official name referring to cooperative socialism. And here's the thing, when we were talking about these two states, they could not be any more different in terms of population sizes. Like, there is really no contest in this matter. Because if Venezuela has a population of around 29 million, well, Guyana is only around 800,000. It is ranked 164th in the world's countries as far as its size. And so again, you go and compare that to Venezuela's population, and you can see that there is a very obvious imbalance of power and influence from the very start of this. Guyana's ethnic makeup is heavily influenced by the effects of the African slave trade and colonialism, and due to the massive amounts of slaves that are required to run plantations, the local demographics in the region were forever changed. After years and years and years of importing massive amounts of slaves to the territory, eventually, slavery would be abolished in England. However, the need for labor is not something that is simply going to go away, and so the British simply started to send over waves of indentured servants from India in order to make sure that exports could keep on flowing. And for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of indentured servitude and how exactly it works, it is essentially like slavery with extra steps and typically in some cases better treatment, but in other cases potentially worse. It really depends upon where you are and what time you're in. Essentially, what would happen is that indentured servants would accept a contract to work for pay for a specified amount of time, and this amount of time and the pay rate for them would many times over pay for their trip to America or other locations, with their work being their only way to actually pay off their contract. In 1838, the British began the process of abolishing slavery throughout the empire, and because of the loss of so much of their free labor, they began then to ship in thousands upon thousands of indentured servants from South Asia, primarily Indian in origin. Because of this, around 40% of the population of Guyana are Indo-Guyanese, meaning that they are of Indian origin. 30% are of African descent, and 17% are mixed, with of course that mixed largely being between African and Indian. The rest of the percentage of the population is simply composed of varying different indigenous natives, as well as some mixture of European and Chinese people. It just varies depending upon where you are. Because of its varied ethnic makeup, Guyana is simultaneously less homogenous than Venezuela itself, with its religious practices as well. Only around 54% of the population identify as Christian, including Protestant, Catholic, and other denominations, and due to the large Indian influence on the country, 31% of the population identify as Hindu, with another 7.5% identifying as Muslim, and another 4% are atheist or agnostic, while the remaining 3% are divided into other religious faiths. In fact, it's actually quite interesting. Even though Muslims only maintain around 7.5% of the population, the current sitting president of Guyana is Irfan Ali, who was actually the first Muslim to take that office. And also because of the fact that this was a territory that was formerly controlled by the British, it is the only country in South America that actually uses English as its official language. Although, that being said, the majority of the population actually speaks more like a form of Guyanese Creole, which is a language that then contains words and phrases that are derived of a mixture of English with loan words from Dutch, various West African languages, and even some South Asian languages. But population and ethnic makeup aren't the only way that these countries are vastly different. In terms of economics, these two countries formerly could not have been further apart from each other. Venezuela's economy has been, and continues to be, to this day, dominated by oil, something that we made sure to talk about in the previous video that we had done on Venezuela's collapse. In 1922, oil was discovered near Maracaibo, and in fact, oil became so important to Venezuela that in 1958, Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, who was a prominent Venezuelan politician, would then come up with the idea of an international oil cartel to effectively help control oil prices and maximize profits in the oil trade. This idea would ultimately develop into the formation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, in 1960, and in 1973, Venezuela would go on to nationalize its oil industry with the development of the Petróleos de Venezuela, commonly referred to as the PDVSA. The PDVSA would then oversee all exploration, production, refining, and exporting of oil and natural gas in Venezuela. And honestly, it makes sense as to why they would do this in the first place. Venezuela has easily the largest oil reserves in the entire world already. But of course, size isn't necessarily everything, because even with Venezuela having the largest oil reserves in the world, due to incompetence and systemic corruption, serious inefficiencies, and accidents that have occurred, at least $11 billion has been stolen or in some way diverted to funding political allies of the government, amongst many other inappropriate and illegal uses of the wealth. It is something that has horribly been managed. something had to change. And so it did change, at least to a degree, when Hugo Chavez would go in and step into the world stage. Now again, if you haven't seen my previous video that I did on Venezuela, you definitely need to go back and watch it, but in order to kind of sum it up very quickly, Hugo Chavez was a high-ranking member of the Venezuelan army, and he is a guy who led an unsuccessful coup back in 1992 and was then imprisoned for nearly 2 years. But his attempt at coupping the government made him into a popular icon to the poor in Venezuela until he could be released by a former political ally who then recently had become president. He then went on to travel to Cuba and was given the Order of Cuba, which was the highest award that could be given to a civilian from the Cuban government. Castro, like Fidel Castro at the time, actually saw a lot of himself in Chavez and took him under his wing in order to become his mentor. The two very quickly became friends, and Chavez would apparently remind Castro of his departed friend, Che Guevara, and they would be close for the rest of their lives. Chavez would then spend the rest of the 90s gaining influence, support, and funding, and would ultimately win the presidency in 1998, taking power in early 1999. And it is during the rule of Hugo Chavez that spending within Venezuela would drastically increase. Hugo Chavez didn't necessarily want to fix the economy or the way that Venezuela was run. He instead wanted to devote more of that spending and what was currently going on to the poor in order to build up his own political base. To that end, he wanted to take on the PDVSA and use its funds in order to be able to fund various different social programs for the poor that would target poverty, illiteracy, hunger, and more. He took what had been a fairly autonomous company and he turned it, essentially, into a direct arm of the government, diverting profits into social spending. Despite wanting to take them on, and this is where it gets really ironic, the payroll of employees within the PDVSA during this time period that Hugo Chavez would be in charge would actually triple even while oil production went on and fell. If that's going to sound odd, then yeah, it probably should. Typically speaking, you don't end up making more money while producing less. Ultimately, oil production would end up rising again, but this was a warning sign of danger to Venezuela that the Venezuelans ultimately would not heed. Simply put, Venezuela's inability to properly manage its vast oil resources was just unsustainable. Chavez would go on to replace high-ranking PDVSA officials with personal friends and political allies in order to support his government. Workers were constantly getting injured and accidents were common, and nobody seemed to really care because everyone was just trying to get their own slice of the massive oil pie. As a side note here, and I have to talk about this because of just how funny this is, back in the year 2006, the PDVSA told its employees that they either had to support Hugo Chavez in the upcoming election or they were going to lose their jobs. That wasn't them saying, oh, hey, go and support Hugo Chavez because if he loses power, that means that we're going to lose, our jobs and work. That means vote for this guy and show that you voted for him, or else I'm going to fire you. That is democracy in action right there, I guess. Either way, by the year 2000, the PDVSA had become the largest company in South America by far, and the 10th most profitable company in the entire world, which is massive, but there is one really big flaw here with Hugo Chavez's plan, and we did talk about that in the previous episode. See, the plan didn't exactly contain any contingencies for what would happen if the price of oil, which had been fairly high for many years, dropped. And we're going to get into that in a second. Chavez would also hold a vote in the year 1999 to go and elect a new constituent assembly that would have the power to abolish government institutions and dismiss officials who were perceived as corrupt or operating only in their own interests. If you understand what it is that means, this would effectively become the supreme authority in the land, overruling the already existing National Assembly, which was Venezuela's version of the United States Congress. Effectively from this, Chavez would have an arm within the government that could dismiss people at will who could be charged with corruption, even though the entirety of the government was arguably already corrupt. This way, anyone that went against him could immediately be ousted at any given moment because they were all equally guilty of something. They wrote a new constitution increasing the powers and limits of the presidency and reducing term limits, and they gave the president the power to legislate on citizens' rights, to promote military officers of his choosing, and to oversee all economic and financial matters. The military was also mandated a role in the government, empowering it to ensure public order and aid national development, which had previously been forbidden under the prior constitution. By the year 2005, Chavez would go on to openly proclaim his ideology, his policies, as everything as the socialism of the 21st century, something that would distance himself from his prior beliefs of Bolivarian socialism, which would merge elements of capitalism and socialism together. He would change his beliefs to be more in line with democratic socialism, and from that try to distance himself from from more of the associations with Marxist-Leninist socialism and the problems that would occur within the USSR and China, claiming, and I kid you not, that they had been too authoritarian while simultaneously then trying to make his government even more authoritarian. Now, ain't that ironic? But that's effectively what it is that he did here. He used the concept of democratic socialism as a smokescreen in order to convince people that he was different, that he was going to be able to change things for the better. And it worked. He did actually change a lot of things, and he would gain re-election for another term in 2006. Oil prices were still pretty high, and so Chavez was able to keep his power for the better part of the next decade, really without too much trouble, until ultimately he would die from a mixture of pelvic cancer and a heart attack in 2013. And of course, it is at this point that Vice President Nicolas Maduro would then take power, and this is when the problems in Venezuela would really start to become more serious. In April of 2013, Maduro was elected president by just 1.5% of the vote, but this was enough to keep him in office. And that seemed like the last chance for the Venezuelans to try and prevent what would happen afterwards. Because at this point, Nicolas Maduro wasn't really trying to be an autocratic leader like Chavez was. He just straight up was a dictator in essentially every sense of the word. Yes, sure, Chavez would control all three arms of the government, but Maduro would go as far as taking control of the food supply for the country and placing it in the direct hands of the military, which would lead to a massive black market trade for basic necessities, just like back in the old USSR. Maduro would even go and shut down 115 different media outlets in a 5-year period for speaking out against his regime. He has ensured from this that all media outlets on TV and newspapers are censored and support the government. And of course, you remember what I said earlier about Chavez's plan not accounting for what would happen if the price of oil dropped? Well, if you've seen the previous video or have studied anything in history, you already know the price of oil dropped. In the year 2014, oil prices would drop sharply, and inflation in Venezuela began to rise drastically. Maduro's way to approach this, however, well, he would take advantage of laws that were put in place by Chavez to manipulate the currency exchange rate for Venezuelan bolivars to other currencies. And here's what it is that I mean, because what this guy did is bad. Essentially, anyone who was a friend or ally or anything of the Maduro regime would receive a very special exchange rate, something where you could exchange 10 bolivars for $1, and that was effectively a fixed price that would maintain, regardless of what the actual value of the bolivar ended up becoming, as it would lose its value through time with inflation. But as I said, that exchange rate only was extended to those that Maduro saw as worthy, meaning that they were friends of the administration. The rest of the population would see inflation effectively go out of control. Like, if you think that a 7, 8, or 9% inflation rate is a bad thing, we're talking about in Venezuela over the course of 2017 through 2018 of an almost 30,000% inflation rate, which is really bad, mind you. So effectively, what would happen is that due to these changes, those with the special exchange rate, those who were friends of the government, had the ability then to begin a lucrative side hustle of going and importing food at the special rate and then selling it on the black market for ludicrous amounts of money, while watching as everyone struggled to pay for things as their spending power with their bolivars dropped by the day. True purchasing power in Venezuela does not actually come from the bolivar. It comes in trading from other people's currencies, specifically the US dollar. And due to various human rights violations, the United States would place economic sanctions on Venezuela in order to pressure Maduro. But this, unfortunately, did very little to help, and in fact would have the opposite effect, as the national debt of Venezuela would balloon, and inflation would then run out of control. Nearly 8 million Venezuelans are estimated to have left the country in the last 20 years, and those who have stayed have had to find a way, any way, that they can in order to try and survive. And this is what brings us to arguably one of the weirdest parts of this entire story, because do you all remember RuneScape, like that 2001 MMORPG? And ironically, thousands upon thousands of Venezuelans have had to turn to this game in order to try and survive. Thousands of Venezuelans over the course of a decade were logging into Venezuela in order to play on these accounts to farm for gold that they would then sell to other players for US dollars, or they would simply play the game religiously, grind the account to get max level in as many things as they could, and then proceed to sell the account to other users for US dollars or bitcoins. Because this, amazingly enough, would actually give them more money and spending power than by working an actual job in Venezuela. Like, no company could offer them of anything that would be of actual value in comparison. For reference of how severe of a situation we're talking about here with economics, in the year 2019, 54% of all transactions within Venezuela were made not in bolivars, but with US dollars. Oddly enough, the economic crisis in Venezuela has also caused a major economic crisis in RuneScape because it has simply so many Venezuelan players. In March of 2019, as an example, Venezuela's electricity grid collapsed, and the country would suffer through a series of rolling blackouts that would leave millions of people without food and water or just power to do anything. And those sudden, but again, temporary drops in player counts would actually then go on to cause severe fluctuations within the RuneScape economy, changing prices drastically based on Venezuela's power situation, because either thousands of people could be in the game at the same time in order to be able to farm and sell goods for cheap, or they wouldn't be able to do anything, thus causing prices to suddenly skyrocket. Genuinely, among all things that I could be possibly talking about at this time, I did not expect this to be one of them. The world is weird, man. The world is weird. So as you all can probably tell, the situation in Venezuela is pretty bleak. But what about Guyana? Well, actually, the story of Guyana's economy is significantly easier to tell. It's way more simple. The economy of Guyana is roughly composed of 15% agriculture, 15% industry, and the remaining 70% primarily work in service, hospitality, or tourism. They have a roughly 12% unemployment rate in comparison to Venezuela's 6%, and their primary exports for years have traditionally been sugar, gold, aluminum, rice, shrimp, molasses, rum, timber, and bauxite. All of this, though, would change in 2015 when massive offshore deposits of oil were discovered by ExxonMobil exploration efforts off of Guyana's coast, primarily in a region known as Essequibo. Does that name sound familiar at all? You know, maybe from what we were talking about this video, perhaps? Yeah, you can probably guess where this is going then. Guyana would go on to start producing crude oil in late 2019, and estimates show oil reserves totaling up to 11 billion barrels. This has made Guyana the world's fastest growing economy, with more oil available to them than countries like Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates. It is estimated that once operating at full scale, this could make Guyana the fourth largest producer of oil in the world, and they are scrambling to try and create as much wealth as possible while the world is still relying on oil and natural gas, before ultimately potentially being able to turn over into greener resources. The Guyanese economy is doing so well that it increased by 62% in 2022, and is then expected to increase by another 37% by the end of this year of 2023. And as you can probably imagine, from the sheer amount of oil wealth that has been discovered, combined with Guyanese low population, this means that per person, the average person is going to get an astronomical amount of money that is going to be coming in to enrich their lives. But remember, again, all of this depends upon oil. And at a time when public support is most certainly against him, Maduro more than likely needs a distraction for the Venezuelan people. And that's how Guyana then comes into play. Now, over the course of this video, we have talked a lot about context. We've talked a lot about the history and economy behind each one of these countries, but what is it with the news, and why is it that this conflict seems to be about to break out in the first place? Where does the dispute come from? You see, in 1899, Venezuela and Guyana would enter into negotiations over a border dispute. In the time of Gran Colombia, the borders of what is now Venezuela would extend all the way across the disputed Essequibo region. An international tribunal would ultimately be set up in order to try and end the dispute, and in the end, British Guyana was awarded Essequibo. The Venezuelans would go on to deem the results invalid and would continue to press their claims, but there wasn't exactly anything that they could do against the might of the British Empire at this time. But then, with the freeing of Guyana from British rule, in 1966, the Geneva Agreement would then try to settle things, ultimately going and ruling in Guyana's favor once again, and the Venezuelans would still go on to claim that the rulings were fraudulent. But of course, when we are talking about this is all the way back in 1966, and so for decades, the Venezuelans didn't really do anything about this. Like, even back during a time when oil prices were high and the economy within Venezuela was surging, they didn't actually do anything. It just so happens that things are now suddenly being pressed after oil was discovered in the region. Convenient. In the last few weeks, Maduro has ramped up rhetoric about Essequibo, and in early December of 2023, he would go on to hold a referendum specifically about this issue. Venezuelan state sources would then claim a voter turnout of 10.5 million votes out of a possible 20 million. What is suspicious about this, though, is that more people seem to show up and vote on this referendum than the entire amount of voters who went and voted for Chavez in 2012. This this coming from a guy who arguably stole an election just 4 years ago. The really sneaky part, though, is that Maduro put 5 questions on the referendum to be voted on, and only one of them was regarding the situation with Essequibo. Intelligence sources within Guyana and other places then claim that the number is likely lower, though we don't know this, somewhere around 1.5 million instead. So the 95% voter turnout claim is completely false. That it just does not make any sense. But either way, the validity of the vote is not what comes into question here. That doesn't really matter because Venezuela is still a very real threat to Guyana. The Essequibo region that we're talking about here, what you can physically see on this map, is something that covers 2/3 of Guyana's country. And due to another border dispute that they have with Suriname, this means that of the country of Guyana, around 80% of the territory that is ruled by Guyana is in dispute, with other countries having claimed said territory. If Guyana goes and loses Essequibo, if they actually lose this territory, then that means that they will lose their future prosperity because of all of the oil that is tied to this. And it's not just oil. Within the region of Essequibo itself, within the rainforest, there are simultaneously large deposits of other minerals that have also been found that can be used. Oil is just the most obvious one for offshore sources. So what are their options then? Well, for that, we are going to have to look at the country's militaries. If this situation ever actually came to armed conflict, it would almost certainly be won by Venezuela, at least on paper. Venezuela has 123,000 active duty service members compared to Guyana's less than 4,000. Venezuela has around 50 fighter jets, while Guyana has none, with only transport planes and helicopters available at this time. The Venezuelan Navy is such a joke that a few years ago, one of their ships actually ended up being sunk after it rammed itself into an unarmed German cruise ship and then just went down. So I mean, very obviously it's not great, but I have to mention that little detail right there. But Guyana, on the other hand, doesn't have a joke of a navy, it just doesn't really have one. Just river patrol boats. Overall, when you are looking at the two powers, on paper, things seem to be overwhelmingly in favor of Venezuela. But for Guyana, there actually are a few things that are going for them. Due to the shape of the South American Caribbean coast in the region, in order for Venezuela to go and attack by sea, they would then have to travel through the territorial waters of numerous different Caribbean countries, as well as potentially running into the US Navy while doing so, as the US Navy is always running missions up and down the Gulf of Mexico, down past the Caribbean during the course of training the Atlantic Fleet. The other saving grace at this time is Guyana's geography. You see, most of the Essequibo region is composed of very thick and treacherous jungle, something that is nearly impossible to navigate with large military vehicles and convoys. There is only one major road in and out of Essequibo, so any defense efforts would only have to focus on one region primarily. There is the other option of going south through part of Brazil and then going around to attack Essequibo from the south, but that is something that already has been blocked by Brazilian President Lula, who has ordered troops to the Venezuelan border in order to make sure that its borders are not encroached upon in order to be able to bypass things. Also, at the same time that all this is going on, the US has been performing military exercises in Guyana in the last few weeks as a show of solidarity with Guyana itself. And this is in addition to the few hundred American service members that are always stationed at the American embassy in the Guyanese capital city of Georgetown. Guyana is also, at the time that all this is going down, asking other members of the international community to please put pressure on Venezuela in the form of economic sanctions, but of course we will see exactly how that goes in the future. So it really brings us to the question here in the end of what are the potential outcomes here, and are any of them actually good? Well, it's really hard to tell. There are rumors that are going on right now, and mind you, of course, I'm saying this, that there are rumors that Putin is supporting Maduro in his efforts to take over this territory from Guyana, as the potential of a conflict breaking out in another part of the world could potentially take news exposure away from Ukraine, much in the same way as the conflict that has broken out between Israel and Hamas has. The goal there in this case would be to distract the United States, to make people around the world care about something else for some time, and then from that potentially not be able to send aid or are unwilling to send more aid to more sources, like in the case of Ukraine. But then again, if there's anything that Americans love to spend money on, it's, the military, so really, who could really tell? Guyana has no air defense systems or artillery, so that is something that they would need to address quickly and could perhaps receive from the US. Russia has been the primary supplier of Venezuela's military equipment and has sold Venezuela much of its old Cold War era equipment. There were even reports in 2019, during one of the coup attempts on Maduro a few years ago, that Wagner mercenaries were seen in Caracas defending Maduro. So really, when we're talking about this, it's not exactly outside of the realm that outside forces could be pushing the possibility of a war here when it comes to Venezuela. If Maduro can prove to be useful to Putin, then potentially this is something that could aid him further down the line. But to be honest, considering everything we've talked about Venezuela, both in this video and also the previous video that we had done on Venezuela's collapse, it doesn't really seem like anything is going to end well for Venezuela here. The rest of the world is currently looking at Venezuela and seems to be wondering what the hell are they doing in the first place? Overwhelmingly, the international community has been behind Guyana on this. There is pretty much no support whatsoever for any Venezuelan claims. So if a conflict actually does break out, if Venezuela does end up sending troops into Guyanese territory, then ultimately they're going to have the international community against them. And this time, perhaps to an even greater degree than what had happened in previous years. The only thing that we can really do in the scenario is wait and see what happens, because a lot of this depend upon the stresses that are placed on Maduro himself. Over the course of history, dictators and autocratic leaders have loved to start conflicts in order to try and distract their people. This is the exact same situation that happened in the case of the Falklands Island War, when Argentina would go and attack the Falkland Islands to take it back from the United Kingdom. And we saw how well that went for them. Under the fear of possibly losing power, of losing everything, it is very possible that Maduro could make a rash decision at some point in the future, but it hasn't quite happened yet. The president of Guyana, Ifran Ali, has been recording interviews left and right with people all over the world, trying to seek as much support as he can possibly get. And he is going to have a lot of decisions that have to be made in the future that are going to have massive impacts upon his people. The only thing is that we're going to have to wait and see as to whether or not those decisions have to be made during peacetime or wartime. Thank you for watching. This has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. I hope you all appreciated this episode. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let us know in the comment section what it is that you would like to see next time. I'm going to be placing a poll here on the community page of this channel in order to get an idea of what it is that you all would like to see next, because there are several things in the works for history and even current geopolitics problems that are currently breaking out in the world. So if these are things that you like, make sure to like the video, because your support means the world to me, particularly with topics that YouTube does not necessarily like. Thank you, my friends, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day. I will see you all next time. Goodbye.